Darius stood across the street, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes fixed on the familiar neon glow of Ellie's grill. The evening crowd buzzed softly through the glass, a hum of conversations blending with the clatter of dishes and the occasional hiss of the grill. For a moment, he felt like a stranger, an outsider looking in on something he once called his own. The weight of the day settled heavy on his shoulders, a restless tension tightening his chest. He had told no one he was coming tonight. No calls, no warnings, just a quiet need to see the place through someone else's eyes. Darius wasn't here as the wealthy owner, the man whose name hung on the faded sign above the door. Tonight, he was just another face in the crowd, an invisible thread woven into the fabric of his own story. Stepping inside, the warm air hit him like a wave, thick with the scent of frying onions and charred meat. The chatter around him rose and fell, a living pulse he hadn't felt in months. Yet beneath the surface, an uneasy quiet stirred in his gut. His gaze swept across the room, noting the casual indifference of the staff behind the counter. There was a coldness there, a disconnect he hadn't expected, like the fire that once burned bright within these walls had dulled to a flicker. He moved slowly, taking a seat at a corner table, careful not to draw attention. His fingers traced the worn grain of the wooden surface, memories flooding back, late nights spent here with his grandmother, the woman who built this place from nothing, pouring every ounce of love and hope into the battered grill and creaky stools. It was her heart beating in every crack, every stain, every whispered conversation carried through the years. But now, the spirit felt fragile, almost broken. Darius caught a glimpse of the cashier, a young woman named Kendall, who spoke with thinly veiled contempt to the new hires. Her words weren't loud, but to him they cut sharper than knives, small betrayals, the kind that chipped away at something greater without anyone noticing. He wondered bitterly how they could not see what this place meant. Not just a job, but a legacy. His chest tightened, a strange ache he couldn't name. Was it guilt? Disappointment? Or something deeper? An unspoken loneliness that came with the weight of expectation, the burden of carrying a dream that others seemed eager to let slip through their fingers? Darius sat back, swallowing the lump in his throat, and let the noise wash over him, each laugh and snide remark another reminder of the distance that had grown between the man and the dream he once nurtured. For a while, he just watched the shifting dynamics behind the counter, the subtle power plays and careless jokes, the way the team ignored the new faces from the outreach program. The very people he had hoped to help were treated as outsiders, unwanted and invisible. The realization struck him hard, like a sudden, cold wind. How had it come to this? In that moment, Darius felt a fracture inside himself, a crack in the foundation he thought was unbreakable. The fight to keep Ellie's grill alive suddenly seemed less like a battle against the market or the economy, and more like a struggle to reclaim something intangible, a piece of his own soul that had somehow slipped away without his notice. And yet, somewhere beneath the bitterness, a fragile spark remained, a small but stubborn hope that this place could still mean something, if only they could find their way back. Darius's quiet observation was soon interrupted by a shift in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of tension that pulsed beneath the surface, barely masked by forced smiles and clipped conversations. The staff moved around with practiced indifference, their movements mechanical, as if the weight of their own frustrations anchored them in place. There was a distinct coldness in their eyes, a barrier they had erected between themselves and the place they worked, a place that, for Darius, was still steeped in meaning. He noticed the way Jenna, the lead waitress, tossed a bitter glance toward the kitchen before muttering something under her breath. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy with resentment. Her shoulders were stiff, her tone clipped, like she was carrying invisible chains. When she approached the table where Darius sat, her smile felt forced, a mask that barely concealed impatience. "Can I get you something?" she asked, voice flat. Darius hesitated, sensing the edge beneath her words, the unspoken history that hung thick in the air. He tried to catch her eye, searching for a sign, any flicker of recognition or warmth, but found only guarded distance. Just a coffee, please, he said softly, hoping to ease the tension, but the brief pause before she nodded suggested otherwise. Behind her, the kitchen door swung open, and a low murmur of discontent floated out. Darius caught fragments of conversation, complaints about long hours, underappreciation, management decisions. Each word was like a silent stab, echoing in his mind, a reminder that the battles he had fought to keep the place running now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. He watched as Marcus, the cook, slammed a pan down with a sharp clang, his face tight with frustration. There was bitterness in his eyes, a mix of exhaustion and anger that felt like a powder keg ready to ignite. Darius wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but the invisible walls were too high, too thick. The younger staff, the outreach hires he had championed, were met with cold shoulders and whispered jokes. They stood awkwardly at the edges, their enthusiasm slowly wilting under the weight of exclusion. Darius's heart ached watching them, caught between hope and rejection, their dreams dimmed by the very place meant to uplift them. As Jenna returned with the coffee, her fingers brushed briefly against his hand, a touch devoid of connection, quick and clinical. She averted her gaze, mumbling, "Let me know if you need anything else," before retreating to the next table. The emptiness in her tone gnawed at him, a hollow echo of the pride and passion that had once fueled Ellie's grill. Sitting back, Darius felt a profound loneliness settle over him. This was no longer just a business struggling to survive. It was a community fractured, a family broken by bitterness and silence. The coldness around him was a mirror reflecting his own fears, that perhaps the legacy he fought for was slipping away, not because of competition or debt, but because the people who mattered most had lost their way, their hearts hardened by disappointment and disillusionment. In that quiet, bruising moment, Darius understood something he hadn't dared admit before. The hardest battle wasn't external. It was the fight to heal what had been broken inside, to restore trust and belonging where only coldness now remained. And if he wanted to save Ellie's grill, he would first have to confront the shadows growing within its walls, starting with the fragile, fractured souls who still called it home. Darius sat alone in the dim light of the empty corner booth, the last sip of his lukewarm coffee lingering on his tongue like a bitter reminder of everything he had hoped to salvage. The noise of the restaurant had faded into a distant hum, and with it, the chaotic dance of clinking plates and sharp voices dissolved into silence around him. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, watching, waiting for something to break. He pressed his palms against the rough wood of the table, feeling the grooves and scratches, each one a silent testament to years of hard work, of dreams hammered out in sweat and sacrifice. But tonight, those marks felt less like milestones and more like cracks. Cracks in the foundation of not just the business, but the fragile ideal he'd built it upon. A pang of disappointment twisted deep inside his chest, sharp and cold. Why had everything changed so much? He asked himself again and again, chasing the question down dark corridors of memory. When had the passion turned into apathy? When had hope wilted into resentment? The faces he trusted, the team he believed in, they were there, but somehow not really present. Ghosts of what used to be, or perhaps what never truly was. Darius thought about the promises he had made, to himself, to his grandmother's memory, to those young hires who once looked at the grill with stars in their eyes. He had envisioned a place where second chances weren't just empty words, where community meant more than a buzzword, where everyone belonged. But instead, he'd walked into a battlefield of silent grudges and fractured spirits, a landscape scarred by neglect and indifference. The weight of failure pressed down, heavy and suffocating. Yet beneath that weight was something more unsettling, a creeping sense of helplessness. He had the means, the resources, the name, but none of it seemed enough to mend what was broken. Money could fix broken ovens or paint peeling walls, but it couldn't reach into hearts hardened by disappointment, couldn't stitch back the fragile threads of trust unraveled by years of neglect. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat thickening. Maybe he had been too focused on what the grill was supposed to be, and not enough on what it had become. Maybe the legacy he carried was less about the building or the brand, and more about the people who breathed life into it, or didn't anymore. A bitter truth settled over him. Saving the grill meant more than saving a business. It meant saving a family, fractured and lost. It meant facing uncomfortable truths about himself, his leadership, his blind spots. How had he missed the warning signs? How had he let the pride that once drove him blind him to the cracks spreading quietly in the shadows? For a long moment, Darius closed his eyes and let the weight of the silence engulf him. He pictured his grandmother's hands, rough but steady, guiding his own as they wiped down counters late into the night. He remembered her voice, soft but unwavering, telling him that hope was the hardest thing to hold on to, but also the most necessary. The question now wasn't whether Ellie's grill could survive the storm. The question was whether he could find the strength to rebuild, not just the place, but the fragile hearts tied to it, starting with his own. And somewhere deep inside, amid the disappointment and despair, a faint ember of resolve began to glow, fragile but persistent, like a flicker of dawn breaking through the darkest night. Darius lingered longer in the shadowed corner of the restaurant, his eyes narrowing as he took in the subtle fractures in the atmosphere. He wasn't just seeing faces anymore. He was beginning to read the unspoken stories etched in every glance, every twitch of muscle, every hurried sigh. It was as if the very air inside the grill was thick with unsaid grievances, a tension so dense it almost had a taste. His mind, once focused on numbers and logistics, now strained to catch the whispers beneath the surface, the currents of quiet discontent swirling just out of reach. He watched Marcus lean against the counter, arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was holding back more than just frustration. The younger cook's eyes flicked toward Jenna as she spoke sharply to a server nearby. There was an edge there, something raw, unfiltered. Darius sensed that beneath the professional facade, emotions were fraying, and the threads were beginning to unravel. The teamwork he'd envisioned had curdled into something brittle, fragile. Feeling an impulse he barely recognized, Darius stood and moved toward the bar where a few of the staff had gathered during a lull. His footsteps were careful, almost hesitant. He didn't want to startle them, but he knew that if he wanted to understand the depth of what was wrong, he had to listen, not just to words, but to the silences in between. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly, voice low, trying to sound less like an outsider and more like someone willing to hear. They glanced up, some startled, some wary. Jenna's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. The others shifted uneasily, caught between defiance and exhaustion. "Darius," Jenna said finally, voice flat but respectful. "What do you want to hear?" He gave a small, sad smile. "The truth." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Marcus spoke, voice low and rough with fatigue. "The truth? Maybe you don't want it. Maybe it's easier to pretend everything's fine than to face what's really going on here." A silence followed, heavy and thick. Darius nodded slowly, inviting more, signaling he was ready. "It's the hours," said another voice, a young server whose face was still fresh with idealism but shadowed by weariness. "We work ourselves into the ground and barely get any respect. Some of us barely make enough to cover rent." Jenna's jaw tightened. "And the changes you brought in, they didn't help. We feel like we're just cogs in some machine now. The heart's gone out of this place." Darius's chest tightened. These weren't just complaints, they were wounds exposed, aching and raw. He could feel the weight of disappointment pressing down on him, but beneath it, something else stirred, a flicker of clarity. These voices weren't enemies. They were mirrors reflecting the fractures he had overlooked, the gaps where care and communication had eroded. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, not out of weakness, but with the sincerity of someone finally seeing the truth. "I didn't realize how much it hurt, how much I failed to listen." Jenna's eyes softened just a fraction, but the tension didn't fully lift. "It's not just about listening," she said, voice weary. "It's about acting, about showing us we matter beyond the bottom line." Darius took a breath, the first real, deep breath he'd taken in days. The road ahead was daunting, steep and riddled with mistakes he couldn't undo. But here, In this small circle of fractured hopes and weary eyes lay the fragile seeds of something that could grow if tended with care. He made a silent vow to himself that he would stay, not just as the owner or the boss, but as someone willing to fight for the heart of Ellie's Grill, the people who gave it life. The question was no longer about saving a business, but about healing the fractures within it, starting from this moment of painful honesty. The morning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of Ellie's Grill, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Darius stood at the threshold of the cramped staff room, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar mixture of anxiety and determination. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day he had promised himself and his weary team that things would begin to change. He had sent out the invitation the day before, simple but sincere. A meeting to talk, really talk. No agenda, no rehearsed speeches, just a space for voices that had long been silenced by exhaustion and resignation. Now, as the staff began to trickle in, faces guarded, eyes flickering with skepticism, Darius felt the weight of their collective doubts settle around him like a dense fog. The room smelled of stale coffee and old grease, a familiar scent that carried memories both bitter and sweet. He took a slow breath, feeling the tension coil tighter in his chest. What if this was a mistake? What if his attempts to bridge the growing chasm only pushed them further away? But then Jenna arrived, her expression unreadable yet resolute. Marcus followed, his shoulders squared but his eyes wary. One by one, the team gathered, a patchwork of hope and hesitation, fatigue and frustration. Darius looked at each face, some familiar, some distant, and felt a piercing ache for the time lost, the silence that had allowed wounds to fester unseen. He began carefully, his voice steady but gentle. "Thank you all for coming. I know things have been hard. I know I haven't been the leader you needed." The admission hung in the air, raw and unpolished. "But I want to listen. I want to understand what this place means to you and how we can make it better. Not just for the business, but for all of us." Jenna's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise or suspicion, but she said nothing yet. Marcus shifted, breaking the silence with a cautious question. "Why now? Why should we believe things will change?" Darius met his gaze without flinching. "Because I've seen what we've lost, and I don't want to lose you too. I'm not here to give empty promises. I'm here to rebuild, and that starts with you." A hush fell over the room as the weight of his words sank in. Slowly, voices began to rise, first tentative, then with growing strength, each one carrying the raw edges of pain, hope, and anger. "It's about respect," said a server with tired eyes. "We want to feel seen, not just used." "It's about trust," Jenna added quietly. "We want to know that when we speak, we're heard, not ignored." Marcus's voice cracked as he spoke of long shifts and mounting stress, the toll it took on his health and family. Others echoed similar struggles, financial worries, lack of support, a sense of invisibility. Darius listened without interruption, absorbing every word like a man drinking from a well he'd long neglected. Each confession was a crack in the dam of resentment, and with every admission, the room grew lighter, more open. When the flood of voices finally slowed, Darius spoke again. "This is just the beginning. We'll make changes, real ones. I want your ideas, your concerns, your vision. Together, we can create a place where we all belong." There was no immediate applause, no sudden breakthrough, just a quiet, fragile acknowledgement. But beneath that fragile silence lay a seed of something new, a tentative trust, a shared commitment to heal the fractures that had threatened to tear them apart. As the meeting broke up, Darius felt the weight inside him shift. It was no longer just the burden of a failing business. It was a responsibility to a family he had nearly forgotten he had. And for the first time in a long while, he believed they might find their way back to one another. After the group meeting had dissolved into a tentative calm, Darius lingered behind, watching the scattered remnants of his team drift back into their routines, their faces still shadowed with skepticism. He knew the real work would come now, not in broad declarations, but in the quiet, difficult conversations that no one wanted to have. Two names echoed in his mind, Jenna and Marcus, the ones whose discontent had cut the deepest, whose defiance wasn't just rebellion but a shield against disappointment. He found Jenna leaning against the battered espresso machine, arms folded tightly, her eyes distant but guarded. The hum of the kitchen surrounded them, a cacophony of clattering dishes and muted chatter, but between them was a fragile silence, charged with unsaid words. "Jenna," he began, voice low and careful. "Can we talk? Just you and me." She looked up, a flicker of surprise mixed with wariness crossing her face. After a pause, she nodded, and he led her to the narrow corridor behind the kitchen, away from prying ears. The moment the door closed behind them, Jenna's posture stiffened, her jaw clenched like she was bracing for impact. "What is it, Darius? Another speech? Another promise I'm supposed to swallow?" "No," he said quietly. "I want to understand you. Not the surface anger, but what's underneath. What made you build these walls?" Her gaze dropped, eyes flickering with a vulnerability she rarely let show. "It's not just about work," she whispered. "It's everything. The way we're treated like numbers. The way no one asks if we're okay, really okay, when we come in each day carrying burdens no one sees." Darius felt a pang deep in his chest. "I didn't realize how much pain was hidden behind your strength." She laughed softly, bitterly. "Strength? Maybe. Or just exhaustion. I've learned to survive by shutting down. If I show weakness here, they eat you alive." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry I let it get this far. I want to do better, but I need you to help me see what I'm missing." For a long moment, Jenna looked at him, searching, skeptical, but also searching for something she hadn't dared hope for. "Maybe," she said finally, "but it's going to take more than words." Meanwhile, Darius's mind churned as he moved toward Marcus, who was stacking dishes with a mechanical detachment that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Approaching cautiously, Darius called his name softly. Marcus didn't look up immediately, his body tense, shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of invisible chains. "Marcus," Darius began, "I want to hear from you, no filters. What's really eating at you?" Marcus set down the last plate with a sharp clatter and finally met Darius's gaze, his eyes hard but shadowed with fatigue. "It's not just the hours or the pay," he said, voice rough. "It's the feeling that none of this matters to you. Like we're just background noise while you chase numbers and deals." Darius swallowed. "I never meant to make you feel invisible. Intentions don't fix reality," Marcus snapped, then took a breath, voice softening. "I came into this job thinking it was more than just a paycheck. I wanted to be part of something real. But lately, it feels like I'm just waiting to burn out." The raw honesty hit Darius harder than any confrontation. "What can I do? How can I make it real again?" Marcus hesitated, then said, "Listen like you did today, but also show it. Show us that you care when it's not convenient, when the numbers don't add up the way you want." Darius nodded solemnly, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I will. I don't have all the answers yet, but I want to try. For you, for Jenna, for all of us." As Marcus gave a curt nod and returned to his work, Darius felt the fragile threads of connection stretching taut but intact, ready to be woven into something stronger, if only he could hold onto them with patience and humility. These conversations were the beginning of a long, uncertain journey, but for the first time, it felt like a journey he wouldn't take alone. The morning light spilled unevenly through the cracked windows of the cafe, casting long, fragile shadows that stretched across the worn wooden floorboards. It was a day like many others on the surface, but beneath the ordinary hum, something subtle had begun to shift, an undercurrent of possibility that Darius felt more acutely than he could have anticipated. After the difficult conversations with Jenna and Marcus, he had spent the night turning their words over and over in his mind, like stones weighed down by regret but polished by hope. The weight of leadership had never felt so real, so personal. He realized that the cracks he'd long ignored were not signs of failure, but invitations to rebuild, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with honest presence. As staff began to filter in, the usual tentative atmosphere seemed to carry a faint pulse of renewal. Jenna arrived first, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of her lips, a quiet acknowledgement that the walls between them had thinned. Marcus followed, his movements less mechanical, his eyes meeting Darius's with a flicker of reluctant trust. Darius greeted them not as subordinates, but as individuals, a small gesture that rippled through the team, softening hardened edges and igniting fragile sparks of connection. He made a point to check in with each person, not just about work tasks, but about their well-being, their challenges, their hopes. Slowly, the impersonal distance gave way to something more human, a fragile, uneven bridge built on respect. Behind the counter, Jenna's usual guardedness softened as she shared a laugh with a new trainee, her voice carrying a lightness that hadn't been there before. Marcus, once withdrawn and sharp, took time to explain a tricky order to a flustered colleague, his patience a quiet testimony to a rekindled sense of purpose. Darius caught these moments with a bittersweet awareness. Change would not be swift or linear. It would be messy, uncomfortable, and demanding. But the glimpse of possibility was enough. Enough to keep pushing, to keep listening, to keep showing up even when doubt threatened to cloud his vision. In a quiet moment, standing alone by the window, Darius allowed himself to breathe deeply, to feel the stirring of hope that had seemed so elusive before. The cafe was no longer just a place to manage. It was a fragile ecosystem of lives intertwined, fragile but capable of growth. And in that fragile ecosystem, he found a new beginning, not in grand plans or sweeping reforms, but in the small, deliberate acts of presence and care that could, over time, transform despair into hope and isolation into belonging. This was the start of something real,